Daniel had always believed that deep space was a quiet place, an endless stretch of black sky scattered with distant lights that looked peaceful from the outside. Working as an engineer on a modest trade vessel, he never thought of himself as a soldier or a hero, only a man who fixed broken machines and kept the ship alive while others handled negotiations. The cargo was simple, mostly minerals and processed metals being ferried from one colony to another, and the crew was small, just 8 men and women doing their jobs, following a routine that seemed safe enough. But safety in space was always an illusion, and Daniel learned this truth when the shadow fell across their ship. It started with alarms blaring through the corridor, the kind of sound that claws its way into your chest and makes you forget how to breathe. The captain shouted orders through the intercom, telling everyone to stay at their stations, but Daniel already felt the tremor in the hull, the kind of vibration that did not come from engines, but from an external force gripping them like a predator catching prey. He stumbled to the nearest viewport and saw the monstrous shape sliding across the stars. It was no freighter or patrol craft, not even a pirate ship he recognized. It was something alive with architecture, its body shaped like a predator's. Skull, hull plates grown rather than built, glowing with veins of red light. The ship belonged to the Valens, though Daniel did not know their name then. What he knew was only fear. He heard the tearing sound as their vessel's walls were cut open, metal shrieking like an animal. Figures stormed inside, towering beings with scaled hides that gleamed like black iron, eyes burning with amber fire, claws that curved like knives. The crew tried to resist, some grabbed sidearms, others tried to run, but resistance was useless. Daniel saw one man lifted by the throat, tossed aside as if weightless. Another was pinned to the wall by a spear of bone-like metal that seemed to grow out of nothing. Daniel froze when one of them turned toward him. The creature was nearly twice his height, shoulders broad as a bulkhead, mouth lined with sharp teeth. And yet it did not kill him. Instead, it reached down, gripped him by the arm as if he were a child, and dragged him along. He shouted, tried to fight back, but his fists landed like raindrops against a mountain. His screams echoed through the corridor until the sound was drowned out by silence, when the rest of the crew stopped moving. He did not know then if they were dead or left behind, and he had no chance to look back. The air changed as the alien ship swallowed him. The atmosphere was thicker, carrying a metallic tang that burned his lungs, and the walls looked alive, pulsing with faint light as though veins ran through the vessel. He was thrown into a chamber lined with cages, some empty, some filled with creatures from worlds he had never seen. Some had wings, some had tusks, some were covered in fur or feathers, and all of them stared at him with eyes that seemed to understand his terror. He pressed against the bars, cold and slick beneath his palms, and wondered why they had taken him alive. Hours, maybe days, passed in confusion. He had no way of knowing time in that place, only the rhythm of footsteps, echoing down corridors, and the occasional roar of some beast in the distance. When the door to his cage finally opened, he expected death. Instead, 2 Valens hauled him out and forced him down a hallway toward a chamber filled with firelight and shadows. At the center stood a throne of bone, and upon it sat a figure, larger than all the others. This one's scales were etched with golden markings, and its crown of horns curled like the branches of a tree. The leader spoke, voice deep enough to shake the walls, words translated through a device that hung from its chest. The language was broken, but clear enough for Daniel to understand. The alien called him rare, spoke of his species as if describing some treasure, and then declared that he would not be killed or consumed, but kept as a living prize. Daniel tried to speak, demanded answers, but the only reply was a rumble of laughter, as though the leader found his defiance amusing. Then the truth was spoken. The Valens had their traditions, and one of them was a mating fight. 2 of their strongest warriors would battle to prove their worthiness. And the prize of victory was not gold or land or weapons, but Daniel himself. He was to be the symbol of status, a possession that would raise the winner to glory, because among the Valens, owning a creature as rare as a human was proof of unmatched power. The words sank into Daniel like ice. He tried to argue, shouted, that he was not an object, that he was not anyone's prize, but the aliens only roared in amusement. They spoke of the coming arena, of the crowd that would gather to watch the blood spill, of how the victor would lift him high as a trophy before thousands. Daniel's mind raced as he was dragged back to his cage. Fear clawed at him, yet beneath it burned something else, something sharper. He had never been a soldier, but he was not about to be a pet in chains. Somewhere in his chest a spark lit, the kind of stubborn fire that belonged to his kind, the kind of defiance that no alien could understand. Alone in that cage, staring through the bars at a future drenched in blood, Daniel whispered to himself that he would not let them decide his fate. The Valens thought they had captured prey, but they had no idea what humanity could become when cornered. The days that followed were a blur for Daniel, not because nothing happened, but because everything that did happen felt unreal, as though he had stepped out of his own life and into some cruel story written by alien hands. The Valens moved him from cage to cage, parading him through corridors where others looked on with hungry eyes, some filled with envy, others with awe, and Daniel realized that he had become something far more than a prisoner. He was a spectacle, a jewel that their society admired, and with each passing hour he understood more clearly why they had not killed him. For them he was a prize, not because of what he could do, but because of what he represented. A human, a rarity in this part of the galaxy, someone whose very existence was seen as valuable beyond measure. On the third day, or perhaps the fourth, he was taken from his cell by 2 armored guards and marched through tunnels that glowed with firelight until he emerged into a vast open space that took his breath away. It was not the sky he saw, but a roof carved like the inside of a volcano, red light flickering from rivers of molten stone that ran beneath transparent floors. Thousands of Valens filled the seats of a colossal amphitheater, their voices rising in a rumble that shook the very air. At the center of this great hall was the arena, a circle of stone and metal, scarred from battles fought long before his arrival, and there, set upon a platform high above the ground, stood a cage shaped like a throne. That was where they placed him, locking the gate behind him as the crowd roared louder. Daniel gripped the cold bars and tried to steady his breathing, his heart thundering in his chest, his eyes scanning the crowd of scaled faces, glowing eyes, and banners painted with symbols he could not read. He felt like an animal displayed in a circus, yet he knew this was no show for entertainment alone. This was ritual, something sacred to them, and he was the object that gave it meaning. His body trembled not just from fear, but from rage at the humiliation, though he forced himself to stay still, to think, to watch. When the drums began to beat, the sound was so deep it vibrated through his bones, a rhythm of war that silenced the crowd and focused all eyes on the gates at either end of the arena. From the first gate emerged Kale, a towering figure with scales darker than obsidian and horns that curved back like blades, his chest covered in scars that told of countless victories. He carried no weapon at first, for the Valens believed that true strength came from claws and teeth, and the crowd thundered his name as he raised his arms, basking in their adoration. From the other gate came Doran, broader, heavier, with scales of bronze that gleamed in the firelight, his every step shaking the ground as he walked. His eyes burned with determination, his jaw set like stone, and though the crowd cheered for both, the air seemed sharper around him, as if he carried not just ambition, but desperation. Daniel watched them approach the center, 2 giants facing each other with only him as the prize between them. He had no choice but to sit high above the circle, exposed to every eye. While they clashed with words Daniel could not understand but could feel in the tone, words of challenge and fury, promises of victory, threats of death. Then the drums fell silent, the air paused, and with a roar that shook the very stones, the fight began. Kale moved first, fast for his size, claws flashing as he struck at Doran, who met the attack with a roar and a swing of his massive arm that knocked Kale back a step. Sparks flew where their claws scraped metal. Dust rose where their bodies slammed against stone, and the crowd screamed in delight as blood was drawn within moments. Daniel's eyes darted from one to the other, his fear almost paralyzing him, yet his mind clung to every detail. Kale fought like a predator, confident, almost careless, trusting his speed and skill. Doran fought like a fortress, absorbing punishment, striking only when sure, but when he did, his blows were devastating. The cage shook as the fight raged on, debris crashing against the bars, and Daniel pressed himself back, realizing that even as a prize he might not survive if one of those warriors hurled the other into his throne. He felt powerless, yet part of him refused to accept that this was all he could do. To sit and wait for whichever monster remained standing. So he forced himself to keep watching, to learn, because knowledge was the only weapon he had left. He saw how Kale overextended when angered, leaving his side exposed for a heartbeat. He saw how Doran's strength faltered when his breathing grew too heavy, his movements slowing like a great machine running out of power. The crowd, blind to these small truths, cared only for blood, but Daniel saw something more. He saw weaknesses, cracks in their mighty forms, and though he could not yet imagine how, he began to believe that those cracks might one day matter. The fight stretched on, both warriors bleeding, their roars echoing across the cavernous hall, until Kale forced Doran to his knees with a brutal strike to the jaw. The crowd howled in approval, chanting Kale's name, their voices rolling like thunder. But Daniel noticed the tremor in Kale's legs, the way his chest heaved, the flicker of pain in his eyes. He was winning, yes, but at a cost, and Doran still clung to life with a stubbornness that reminded Daniel of himself. As the fight paused for a heartbeat, both warriors circling, Daniel's eyes lifted to the crowd, to the thousands watching, and he realized that they were not watching Kale or Doran alone. They were watching him as well, waiting to see who would claim the human, who would raise him up in triumph. He was not just a prize. He was part of the battle itself, and in that moment, Daniel understood something terrifying but also empowering. He was not powerless at all, not if he could find a way to turn their obsession with him into a weapon. The drums began again, the warriors charged, and the cage rattled as the fight roared back to life. But Daniel's mind no longer drifted helplessly in fear. He was thinking, planning, waiting. If this was an arena, then he would not be a prize forever. Somehow, some way, he would become a player in this deadly game. The arena was alive with noise as Kale and Doran circled each other, their claws dragging across the stone floor, sending sparks into the air, the crowd stamping their feet in rhythm with the drums that pounded like the heart of some giant beast. Daniel gripped the bars of his cage, his knuckles white, his mind a storm of fear and thought, because he knew he was not only watching two monsters fight, he was also watching his own future being torn apart blow by blow. Kale struck first with the swiftness of a predator, his claws flashing in arcs that cut the air. Doran blocked with his forearms, his scales grinding against Kale's claws like metal on metal, the force of the impact sending a shock through the arena. Doran answered with a headbutt that cracked against Kale's chest, sending the black-scaled warrior stumbling back a few steps. The crowd erupted in roars of approval, their glowing eyes fixed on every strike. Every drop of blood fell to the ground. Daniel leaned forward, unable to look away. Kale was faster, his movements sharp and unpredictable. He darted from side to side like lightning, his claws slicing across Doran's arms and shoulders, leaving lines of crimson glowing In the firelight, Doran, however, was like a mountain, unmoving, steady each time. He was cut, he grunted, but he did not fall. Instead, he waited, biding his time until his huge fists could swing with the force of a hammer. When he struck Cale across the jaw, the sound echoed like a drum, and Cale's body spun before he landed hard against the stone wall. Daniel felt the tremor through his cage, but he also noticed the way Cale got up quickly, snarling with rage, his pride wounded more than his flesh. Cale charged again, striking with fury, not thought, each blow faster than the last, but his speed was now reckless. Daniel saw it clear as day. Cale overextended each time, his torso wide open for a counterattack. The crowd did not notice, they only screamed for blood, but Daniel's human eyes, trained by years of fixing machines and studying their flaws, caught details others missed. He whispered to himself almost without realizing, he leaves himself open every time he grows angry. Doran, too, was not flawless. Daniel saw how his heavy body moved slower with each passing minute, his breathing louder, his chest rising and falling like a bellows. He relied on his strength to finish the fight quickly, but when Cale did not fall, Doran began to tire. The sweat that glistened across his bronze scales told Daniel that his power was not endless. The battle grew more violent. Cale leaped onto Doran's back, clawing down with savage strength. Doran bellowed and slammed his body backward into a stone pillar, crushing Cale against it. Dust rained from above, the pillar cracked, and Daniel covered his face as fragments struck the cage bars. Cale slid down, coughing blood, yet his eyes still burned with defiance. He rolled aside just as Doran's foot came crashing down, splintering the stone where Cale had lain a heartbeat before. Daniel's heart raced with the fight, his breath rising and falling as if he too was battling in that ring. He realized how invested he was, not in cheering for one side but in survival, because whoever won would claim him. He was supposed to fear that truth, yet a new thought crept into his mind. If he could somehow tilt the balance, if he could use his presence, his words, his timing, perhaps he would not just be a prize at all. Perhaps he could decide who walked away victorious. The fight dragged on longer than the crowd expected, and the energy of the arena shifted. Some Valens shouted Cale's name, others roared for Doran, but now they watched with more intensity, because the duel was no longer a show of brute power. It was becoming a struggle of endurance, of will, of cunning. Daniel could see in their faces that they were beginning to respect both warriors, yet he also saw something else when their glowing eyes flicked up toward him. They were waiting to see how the human would react, which warrior he would favor. It was as if, even though he was locked in a cage, his response carried weight. Cale lunged again, this time aiming a claw at Doran's throat, but Doran twisted aside and caught Cale by the arm, snapping it back with a sickening crack. The crowd roared at the sound. Cale howled in fury, his limb now limp, yet somehow he did not stop. He spun around, raking his claws across Doran's chest with his good hand, tearing through scales and drawing a gush of blood that sprayed across the arena. Doran staggered, clutching his chest, his face twisted in pain. Cale laughed a cruel sound, even as his own arm hung broken. Daniel shivered at that laugh, because it was not victory he heard, but madness. For a moment, Daniel thought Doran would collapse, but the bronze-scaled giant steadied himself, his breath ragged, his eyes filled with fire. He roared louder than ever, slamming his fists against his chest and charging Cale with such force that the arena floor shook. Both bodies collided like two meteors, and the shockwave made Daniel's cage rattle so violently he thought it would break apart. He held tight, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. As the warriors stumbled apart, both bloodied, both staggering, Daniel felt a strange shift inside himself. Fear still lived in him, but beneath it grew something else. Not hope exactly, but determination. He was no longer only watching two monsters fight. He was watching two flawed beings with strengths and weaknesses just like any other. And for the first time, he believed that maybe, just maybe, a human could find a way to stand among them, not as prey, not as a prize, as someone who could change the outcome. The drums thundered again, urging the warriors onward, the crowd rising to their feet, screaming for the final clash. Kale limped forward, his broken arm dangling, but his teeth bared. Doran lifted his fists, his chest heaving, each breath a battle of its own. They were ready to end it one way or another, and Daniel knew that when one fell, his own fate would be sealed. He pressed his face to the bars, whispered to himself again and again, "I will not be theirs. I will not be a prize." The clash that came next would decide everything, yet Daniel already understood a truth the Valens could not see. The fight was not only theirs, it was his too, and somehow he would find a way to play his part. The arena was trembling with sound as Kale and Doran closed in for what the crowd expected to be the final moments of their brutal contest. Daniel gripped the bars of his cage with sweat dripping from his palms, and his mind racing faster than his heart. He had spent the entire fight watching every detail, every flaw in the way each warrior moved, and now he realized that the cracks were widening. Kale's arrogance made him reckless, his broken arm flailing uselessly as he still tried to act invincible, while Doran, though stronger with each swing, was slowing down, his breaths dragging in ragged gasps and his body heavy as stone. Daniel knew in that instant that if he did nothing, the fight would end soon, and his life would belong to whichever beast still stood. And he could not accept that fate. Kale lunged at Doran, clawing with his good arm. Teeth bared, his voice rising in a scream that echoed through the chamber. Doran braced and caught him by the throat, slamming him down into the stone floor with such force that dust rose like smoke from a fire. The crowd went wild, chanting for blood, stamping their feet against the ground in a thunderous rhythm. Daniel felt the cage shake again. But this time it was not only the fight that shook him, it was the realization that the crowd wanted him to play a part too. Their eyes were flicking to him, waiting to see fear or surrender, and Daniel suddenly understood that he could use that. He might not have claws or scales, but he had something else. He had wit, and he had the ability to turn the attention of thousands. He shouted across the arena, his voice cracking yet cutting through the roar of the crowd. He yelled at Kale, "You are weak, you are broken, and you know it." The words hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed no one had heard, but then Kale twisted his head up, his amber eyes locking on Daniel, fury blazing brighter than before. Daniel had no weapon in his hand, but his words were sharper than blades. He saw Kale's anger flare, and in that distraction, Doran struck again, smashing his fist into Kale's side and sending him rolling across the floor. The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock spreading through them. Daniel's heart leapt in his chest. He had done it. He had actually tilted the fight by speaking at the right moment, but he was not finished. He turned his eyes on Doran, who was now stumbling forward, trying to press his advantage. He shouted louder this time, "You are slow, you are tired, you cannot finish him before you fall yourself." Doran's head snapped up, his gaze filled with rage, as if he could crush Daniel with his stare. Alone, and in that heartbeat of distraction, Kale used his good arm to rake claws across Doran's chest, tearing another deep wound. Amphitheater exploded in sound. Never before had a prize spoken. Never before had a human turned the duel into something more than combat. The warriors were no longer only fighting each other. They were now fighting the words of the human high in the cage. Daniel gripped the bars harder, his fear replaced by fire, because he had found his weapon, and it was not steel or strength, but the ability to see what the giants could not. Kale staggered upright, his body battered, his arm broken, his blood painting the arena floor, yet his eyes were fixed not on Doran but on Daniel, as though he realized too late that the human was shaping the outcome. Doran too glared at him, his heavy body shaking with exhaustion, his chest heaving with every ragged breath. Daniel's voice had reached them both, and now neither could ignore him. The crowd sensed it too. Their chanting had shifted from names to a single rising cry, "Human, human, human." Their voices echoing like thunder, as if the arena itself was awakening to the idea that the prize had become the true center of the fight. Daniel's cage rattled as the warriors crashed together again, Kale clawing with fury, Doran striking with fists that broke stone, their bodies slamming into the ground again and again. Daniel's mind raced. He knew if either of them managed to win now, they would likely take out their humiliation on him. He had to act quickly. He pressed against the bars, pushing with all his strength, and to his shock, the weakened metal groaned. It had been struck too many times by flying debris during the battle. He shoved harder and harder until one of the bars bent just enough for him to squeeze through. The crowd roared in disbelief as Daniel dropped from the cage onto the stone floor below. His legs shook from the impact, but he remained standing facing the two titans who froze for a single heartbeat, both stunned that the fragile human dared step into their circle. Daniel's chest heaved as he lifted a shard of broken stone from the ground, holding it like a knife. Though it was barely sharp enough to cut, he did not care. The point was not the weapon, but the act itself. He was no longer sitting high as a prize. He was standing in the arena as a player. Kale roared and charged at him, his pride too wounded to allow such defiance. But Daniel did not run. He waited until the last moment, then dove aside, Kale's momentum carrying him forward into Doran, who had been trying to rise. The two titans crashed together in a violent heap, and the ground cracked beneath them. Daniel scrambled up, shouting again loud enough to cut through the chaos. "You are both beaten. Neither of you deserves to win. You cannot even bring down a single human." The words struck deeper than any claw could. The crowd gasped, then erupted in shouts, some of rage, some of disbelief, some of wild laughter. Never before had a human shamed two Valen warriors in the heart of their most sacred arena. The fighters rose again, but their fury was now unfocused, their strength draining with every breath. Daniel stood his ground, trembling but refusing to back down. His defiance was a weapon sharper than any claw, and he had just driven it into their pride. The duel that had begun as a battle for him was no longer about claiming a prize. It had become a struggle to restore honor. But Daniel knew their honor was already shattered. He had taken it from them by proving that a human could stand in their circle and defy their traditions. The crowd's chant grew louder, shifting again, "Human, human, human," until it rolled like thunder against the cavern walls. Daniel stood tall, blood, dust, and sweat clinging to him, his shard of stone trembling in his hand, but his eyes burning with fire. The fight was no longer between Kale and Doran alone. The human had entered it, and nothing in the Valen world would ever be the same again. The arena was no longer the same place it had been when Daniel first entered it from the high cage above, because now the crowd was no longer chanting the names of Kale or Doran. They were chanting for the human who had stepped down into the circle, who had dared to shout at their strongest warriors and twist the fight into something no one had ever seen before. Daniel stood in the dust, holding the jagged shard of stone in his hand, his chest heaving with every breath, his legs trembling, but his eyes unbroken. Kale and Doran faced him, both covered in blood, their scales cracked, their bodies bent by exhaustion. Yet their fury was burning not only at each other, but at the man who had stolen the fight from them. Kale roared and charged again, his broken arm swinging uselessly while his good claws reached for Daniel, but Daniel darted aside with the speed of someone who had nothing left to lose. Kale's body crashed into the wall, leaving another crack in the stone, and Daniel shouted again loud enough for the entire amphitheater to hear, "You are not strong, you are blind with pride. You could not even see me slip free from the cage." Doran staggered forward, his massive fists swinging, but Daniel pointed at him and cried, "You are slow, your strength is empty. You are too tired to catch me. You are nothing but noise." Words sliced deeper than any blade, because among the Valen's honor was carved into pride, and in that moment, both Kale and Doran knew the truth of it. The human had made them appear weak before thousands. The crowd erupted into shouts, some angry, some amazed, but none able to deny that Daniel had shifted the battle completely. The two giants tried once more to clash with each other, Kale clawing in rage, Doran pounding with fists, but their movements were sloppy, heavy, broken. They stumbled against each other like wounded beasts, while Daniel stood tall between them, his shard raised high, not because it could kill, but because it symbolized defiance. Then came the moment that changed everything. Kale lunged at Daniel, but his injured leg buckled, and he fell forward sprawling in the dust. Doran tried to seize the chance to finish him, but his chest seized with pain. His strength at last failing him, and he collapsed to one knee, gasping for air. The arena fell silent for a heartbeat as both mighty warriors struggled on the ground, unable to rise. Daniel looked around at the thousands of glowing eyes fixed on him. He raised his voice once more and declared, "I am not a prize. I am not your treasure. I am human, and I will not belong to anyone." Silence broke like glass under a hammer. The crowd roared in shock and awe, their voices echoing through the cavern walls, and for the first time in their long traditions, they had seen a prize refuse its role. They had seen a human take the arena not with strength of body, but with strength of will. Daniel threw down the shard of stone at his feet, the sound sharp. As it struck the ground, he lifted his hands open, not in surrender, but in challenge, daring the entire amphitheater to deny what they had just witnessed. The golden-marked matriarch, seated on the throne of bone at the far end of the hall, rose slowly. Her massive body towering above all others, her eyes glowing brighter than fire. She raised a single clawed hand, and the roar of the crowd fell instantly to silence. Her voice rolled out deep and heavy, each word shaking the air as the translation device carried it in broken but clear human speech. She said, "The human has spoken. The human has fought not with claws, not with teeth, but with spirit. He is not a prize. He is victory." Declaration struck the arena like lightning. The crowd erupted again, but this time in chants not of Kale or Doran, but of Daniel. Daniel rolling like thunder from every throat. The matriarch lifted her hand again, and all voices silenced. She pointed down at the arena, at the broken warriors lying in the dust, and then at Daniel standing tall among them. She declared, "Both warriors have lost. The human has won. He is free." Daniel's knees weakened at the words, yet he forced himself to stay standing, his chest rising and falling as he stared up at the matriarch. He could not believe what he had just heard. But the truth was undeniable. He was no longer a prize. He was the victor of their sacred contest. The guards did not move to seize him. The crowd did not rise to attack him, because in the eyes of their people, the word of the matriarch was law, and Daniel had just been crowned not property, but legend. Kale growled from the ground, spitting blood, his eyes burning with hatred. Doran slumped forward, clutching his chest, shame written across his face. They had fought with claws and power, but they had lost to a man who had nothing but his voice and his courage. Daniel turned away from them because they no longer mattered. He walked slowly across the arena, each step heavy yet filled with purpose, as the crowd parted to let him pass. He had been dragged into this place as prey, but he was leaving it as something far greater. When he reached the gates at the edge of the circle, 2 guards bowed their heads and opened the way. The path beyond led out into the alien city, where the fires of 1,000 towers burned, and where his name would already be spreading. Among them, Daniel did not know what his future would hold, whether he would find a way back to his own people, or whether he would carve a new life here among these giants. But he knew one thing for certain: he would never again be caged. He had taken the worst fate imaginable and turned it into victory, and no matter what came next, that truth would follow him forever. As he stepped out beneath the alien sky, the crowd still chanting his name behind him, Daniel lifted his head and whispered to himself, not in fear, but in triumph, "They will never own me. I am free, and I am human." And with that, the story of the human who became a prize ended with the birth of the human who became a legend. The end.